In the summer of 1974, a British archaeologist working on the outskirts of ancient Nippur pulled a small clay tablet from the corner of a collapsed storage room. It was no larger than a man's palm. The cuneiform pressed into its surface was so dense and so tightly packed that the man who found it assumed at first it was an inventory list, or perhaps a temple ledger. He wrapped it in cotton, filed it under a catalog number, and sent it back to a university in Zurich where it sat in a wooden drawer for almost 30 years. Nobody read it, nobody translated it. The archaeologist who found it died in 1981 without ever knowing what he had actually pulled out of that dirt. The tablet was cataloged as N4471. When a Swiss linguist finally sat down with it in the winter of 2003, she stopped reading after the third line. She got up from her desk. She walked out of the room. She did not return to that tablet for 6 days. What she had just read, in her own words later, was a description of something the Nephilim were afraid of, not something they fought, not something they hunted, something they hid from, something that made the giants of the ancient world, the beings who, according to every surviving text, stood 11 to 15 feet tall and could tear a lion in half with their bare hands, run and cower and beg the sky for silence. And the strangest part of what she read was this: what terrified them was not larger than they were. It was not more numerous. It did not carry weapons in any sense we would recognize. The tablet described it, in the original Sumerian, using a word that had no direct equivalent in any other text of that period. The closest translation she could arrive at, after months of comparison against every known cuneiform corpus, was a single phrase: the quiet ones. Or perhaps more accurately, the ones who do not blink. Her name was Dr. Ilse Vogel. She was 52 years old at the time. She had translated Sumerian for almost 3 decades, and she had a reputation among her colleagues for being unshakable, unemotional. A scholar who would look at a description of ritual sacrifice or infant mutilation and continue reading without so much as a shift in her posture. And yet this tablet, this palm-sized thing that had been sitting in a drawer for 30 years, made her leave the room. What she eventually reconstructed, over the course of 18 months of translation work, was a text that reads more like a warning than a myth. It is not a poem. It is not a hymn. What it is a story in the sense that a survivor's account is a story. It reads, from beginning to end, like something a survivor wrote down for the benefit of anyone who might come after. A message from someone who had seen the giants, and had seen what the giants were afraid of, and had lived long enough to try to explain it. To understand why this tablet is so historically strange, you have to understand what we thought we knew about the Nephilim. Genesis describes them briefly, in the opening verses of chapter 6, as the offspring of the sons of God and the daughters of men. The book of Enoch describes them in far greater detail. According to Enoch, the Nephilim were the children of 200 angelic beings who descended from the higher heavens, took wives from among the human population, and produced offspring that grew to enormous size. They consumed everything, they fought each other, they terrorized the cities of men, and they feared, according to every source that has survived, nothing. That is the received tradition. The Nephilim were fearless. They ruled the ancient world by force and size and the sheer impossibility of anything challenging them. When they finally fell, according to the standard account, they fell to the flood. Tablet N 4471 tells a different story. It agrees the giants existed. It agrees they were enormous. It agrees they ruled the valleys and took what they wanted from the small men who lived there. But it disagrees completely about their fearlessness. According to N 4471, the Nephilim were terrified. Not of the flood, not of the fire, not of any weapon a human or beast could bring against them. They were terrified of a specific presence, something that lived in the same valleys they ruled, that they could see every day, and that they walked past with their eyes lowered and their voices held to a whisper. And what she found written on that tablet is what we are going to walk through today. All of it. Every code, every passage, every specific detail she was able to translate before she stopped speaking about the tablet in 2011 and moved to a small village in the Alps where, as far as anyone knows, she still lives. And before we go further, I need to pause for a second, because what I'm about to tell you gets significantly darker. And I realized a while ago that some of this cannot be fully explained in a video format. The complete decoding of all 12 codes, the tablet numbers, the translated passages, the astronomical date they specified down to the degree, I put it all into a written document. It's linked below, and the QR code is on your screen. Now let's continue. The first thing to understand about N 4471 is the way it opens. Sumerian tablets typically begin with an invocation, a dedication to a god, a naming of the scribe, a blessing on the reader. This tablet does none of those things. It begins with a single line, translated as follows: "Do not read this aloud." That is the opening. Not a prayer, not a name, a prohibition. Do not read this aloud. And the reason, the tablet claims, is that the beings it is about to describe are drawn to the sound of their own name. Speaking of them, in Dr. Vogel's translation, was considered by the scribe to be an act of summoning. The second line establishes who is writing. The scribe identifies himself only as one who remained. His name is not given, he does not give his city. Only a single detail. He says he was small when the giants walked, and he was old when they fell, and he had lived through the entire span in between. He also says, in a line Dr. Vogel found impossible to fully verify against other sources, that he had personally seen a Nephilim kneel and press its face to the ground, and weep, because of what stood in the doorway of its own dwelling. The third line is the one that made her leave the room. It reads in her translation as follows: "The tall ones did not fear the flood. The tall ones did not fear the fire. The tall ones did not fear the sword of any man or the horn of any beast. The tall ones feared only the quiet ones. And the quiet ones were already here. Already here. That is the phrase. Not coming. Not arriving. Already here." The scribe was writing to whoever might read this in the future, and he wanted them to understand that whatever the giants had been afraid of had not gone away with the giants. It had stayed. It was still in the world when he was writing. And the implication, which Dr. Vogel found terrifying enough that she stopped reading, was that it might still be in the world now. The fourth passage on the tablet describes what the quiet ones looked like. Or rather, it describes what they did not look like. The scribe is very careful here. He says they were not tall. He says they were not short. According to him, they did not have wings, and they did not have horns, and they did not carry weapons of any kind. He says their faces were like the faces of men, but their eyes did not move. Their skin, he writes, was pale in some accounts and dark in others, and he says this was because the quiet ones did not have a single fixed appearance. They looked, he wrote, like whoever was standing next to them. That is the passage that has generated the most argument among the small number of scholars who have been given access to Dr. Vogel's translation notes. Some believe it is a metaphor, that the scribe is describing a kind of psychological camouflage, a way of blending in that had nothing to do with physical shapeshifting. Others believe he meant it literally, that the quiet ones could mimic the appearance of any being they stood beside, and that this was the reason the Nephilim could never fight them. You cannot fight something that is standing next to your own reflection. The fifth passage describes how the giants first encountered them. This is where the tablet becomes, in Dr. Vogel's words, historically explosive, because the scribe does not say the quiet ones came from the sky. He does not say they came from the sea. He says they were already in the land when the giants arrived. He says the giants came down from the mountains, from the high places, from what he calls the seats of their fathers, and they walked into the valleys expecting to find only men. Small, easily frightened men who would kneel before them and give whatever they demanded. And instead, in the valleys, they found the quiet ones, waiting, not hostile, not aggressive, simply present. And the giants, according to the tablet, understood immediately that these beings were not men and were not something they could rule and were not something they could kill. And the giants went back to the mountains for a full generation before they tried to return. And when they returned, they came with what the scribe calls the second bargain, which is the sixth passage, which is where the tablet gets significantly stranger. The sixth passage describes an agreement, a negotiation. The Nephilim, having realized they could not conquer the valleys, sent one of their own to speak with the quiet ones. The scribe does not name this Nephilim, but he describes him, 13 cubits tall, hair like copper wire, eyes that reflected torchlight even in complete darkness. He walked into the valley alone and unarmed, and sat down across from 3 of the quiet ones, and spoke to them for what the scribe says was 9 days and 9 nights without stopping, without eating, without sleeping. On the 10th morning he stood up and walked back to the mountains, and the Nephilim descended into the valleys, and they built their cities, and the quiet ones did not oppose them. But there was a condition, and the 7th passage is that condition. And this is where the tablet becomes, in the view of some who have read it, either the greatest hoax of the 21st century or the most important document ever pulled from Mesopotamian soil. The condition, according to the tablet, was this: the giants could live in the valleys, they could build their cities, they could rule the small men and take their food and their daughters and their gold. But they could never approach the doorways of the quiet ones. They could never speak of the quiet ones by their true name. And they could never, Under any circumstance, look directly at a quiet one's face for longer than 3 heartbeats. If they did, according to the scribe, they would forget who they were. Not die, not fall ill. Forget their names, forget their fathers, forget even the sound of their own voices. And they would wander the valleys, mute and empty, until they starved. That is what the giants were afraid of. Not death, erasure, being unmade from the inside out, being turned into something that walked and breathed but no longer remembered that it had ever been alive. And the scribe says in a line that Dr. Vogel translated 3 separate times to be sure that he had seen this happen, twice. He had watched 2 Nephilim, both of them warriors, both of them 10 cubits tall or more, walk out of the presence of a quiet one with their eyes open and their mouths slack and no recognition of anyone who called their names. They lived, the scribe wrote, for another few weeks. They ate when food was placed in front of them, they drank when water was offered, and then they simply stopped and lay down and did not get up again. Before we move on to the next code, stop for a second. What you just heard about code 7 is the part that changes everything. But it only makes sense when you see it written out next to the original Sumerian notation. The exact wording of the condition. The trigger of 3 heartbeats. It's all in the document linked below. Take 5 seconds right now, grab it, and then come back. Because what comes next builds directly on it. The link is in the description. QR code is on your screen. The 8th passage moves from history into what the scribe calls the shape of things. Here the tablet stops describing events and starts describing what the quiet ones actually were. The scribe uses a word Dr. Vogel translated as watchers of the record. Not watchers of men, not watchers of the sky, watchers of the record. As if their function in the world was to keep track of something, to witness, to remember. The implication, which runs underneath the entire tablet, is that they were older than the Nephilim, older than the men, older, possibly, than the world in which any of these beings lived. The scribe writes that the quiet ones did not eat, they did not drink, they did not sleep. They stood in the doorways of small houses in the valleys and they watched. When a person or a giant or an animal walked past them, they did nothing. They did not turn their heads, they did not move their eyes, they simply saw. Whatever they saw, according to the scribe, was recorded somewhere. He does not say where. He does not say how. He says only that the quiet ones were the memory of everything that happened, and that this memory had never belonged to men or to giants. The 9th passage describes what happened to the Nephilim in the end. This is where the tablet contradicts, or supplements, every surviving source we have about the fate of the giants. In the standard telling, the Nephilim were destroyed in the flood. The waters came. The waters covered the earth, and the giants drowned, along with everything else that had corrupted the world. The tablet tells a different story. According to the scribe, the flood did come. Waters did rise. But the giants did not drown. They ran. They ran from the valleys back into the mountains, and from the mountains into the high places, and from the high places into what the scribe calls the shelters that had been prepared. In those shelters, the giants survived, some of them. When the waters receded, they came out and walked back down into the valleys, and they found the quiet ones still standing in the doorways, waiting, as if nothing had happened, as if the flood had been a matter of a few weeks. The giants, according to the scribe, understood at that moment that they had never been the rulers of anything. The quiet ones had allowed them to live in the valleys because it suited some purpose the giants would never understand. And the same beings who had allowed them to live could, at any moment, stop allowing it. The giants, one by one, over the next several generations, walked into the presence of the quiet ones and did not walk out. Some of them, the scribe writes, did it deliberately. They chose the erasure over the waiting. The 10th passage describes what the scribe himself did after he finished writing this. He sealed the tablet in a jar. He buried the jar under the floor of a storage room in a temple complex on the outskirts of Nippur. He did this so that the tablet would be found later, by someone who could read it, and who would need to know. The 11th passage is a warning. The quiet ones, according to the scribe, do not die. They are not born, they are not created. They simply are, and simply were, and will simply be. He writes that they have been in the world for as long as there has been a world, and will remain for as long as the world remains. They do not care about men, and did not care about giants, and will not care about whoever reads this, but they are watching. They have always been watching. They are, at this moment, standing in doorways all over the world. The doorways of houses, the doorways of temples. Any doorway, anywhere people gather and talk and remember and forget. The 12th and final passage on the tablet is one line, a single sentence. Dr. Vogel translated it, retranslated it, and sent it to 3 separate colleagues for verification. All 3 agreed on the meaning. The line reads as follows: "If you have read this far, you have already seen one." That is how the tablet ends. Not with an invocation, not with a blessing, with that sentence. The implication, which Dr. Vogel found so disturbing that she stopped presenting her research at conferences in 2011, is that the quiet ones are so common in the world, so completely woven into the fabric of ordinary human experience, that anyone reading a text about them has almost certainly already stood in the same room as one and walked past and thought nothing of it. Because that is what the quiet ones do. They stand in the doorway, they watch, and nobody remembers them. Now, there are 3 possibilities here. The first is that the tablet is a forgery, perhaps produced in the 20th century by someone who wanted to seed a modern myth. Dr. Vogel considered this seriously. She had the clay analyzed. She had the cuneiform compared against known scribal hands from the period. She found no evidence of forgery. The clay and the wedge shapes were consistent with a scribe working in the late 3rd millennium before the Common Era. If it was a forgery, no test she or anyone else has run on it has been able to detect the deception. The second possibility is that the tablet is authentic, but the scribe was writing a myth, that the quiet ones were a symbolic representation of something else, a religious concept, a philosophical warning about the nature of memory and forgetting, a literary device intended to explain the disappearance of the giant traditions from Mesopotamian religion. Under this reading, the tablet is significant, but it is not a historical account. It is a piece of ancient fiction. The third possibility is the one that Dr. Vogel, in the last interview she gave before she moved to the Alps, said she could not entirely rule out. That the tablet is authentic, the scribe was writing what he believed to be true, and the quiet ones were real. That there existed, at some point in human prehistory, a species that stood in doorways and could unmake the minds of anyone who looked at them for too long. And that this species did not necessarily leave when the giants left, that it may still be here. She would not commit to that possibility publicly. She said only that she could not rule it out. She said, in the final line of that final interview, that she had begun to notice something in the years after she completed the translation. When she walked into rooms where people were gathered, she would sometimes catch a glimpse of someone standing near the door, someone she did not recognize, someone whose face she could not quite hold in her memory even seconds after looking away. This happened often enough that she stopped attending large gatherings. It was one of the reasons she left Zurich. The question that hangs over all of this is simple. If the tablet is telling the truth, what are they watching for? What are they recording? What are they waiting to see? The scribe does not tell us. He may not have known. He tells us only that they are there, and have always been there, and that whatever purpose they serve is not a purpose that men or giants were ever meant to understand. Some who have read the translation suggest that the quiet ones are the reason so many ancient texts describe beings who watched. The Watchers of Enoch, the Neteru of Egypt. Silent observers referenced in fragmentary passages from unrelated cultures. The idea being that every civilization encountered these beings and gave them a different name, but they were all describing the same thing, the same standing figures, the same unmoving eyes. Others have connected the tablet's description of erasure to modern accounts of experiences people struggle to describe. The sudden blank spot in memory. The sense of walking into a room and not being able to remember why. The moment of catching a stranger's eye across a public place and feeling, for a single second, that you have forgotten your own name. We attribute these to stress, or fatigue, or the ordinary lapses of a distracted mind. The tablet suggests these moments are the edge of something much older, and that we brush against it constantly without recognizing what we are touching. Dr. Vogel died in 2019. Her death was not widely reported. The tablet remains in a private collection in Switzerland, in the possession of a family who inherited it from the archaeologist who found it in 1974. They have not released it for further study. They have not permitted photographs. The full translation exists only in her notes, which are held by the same family, and which have been made available to a small number of researchers under strict conditions of confidentiality. What is known is that a scribe, 4,000 years ago, sat down and wrote a warning. The warning was that giants had walked the earth, and they had feared nothing, until they had encountered something that made them kneel and weep. And that something was still here. Standing in doorways, watching, waiting for whatever it is waiting for. If the scribe was right, every doorway you have ever walked past has been an opportunity for one of them to look at you. If he was right about the 3 heartbeats, then the only reason you are still yourself, still remembering your own name, is that none of the ones you passed have chosen to hold your gaze for longer than a breath. Not yet, not so far. Dr. Vogel wrote in her private notes, in a passage found after her death, that the quiet ones do not need to erase everyone. They only need to erase the ones who might have said something. The ones who might have written it down. The ones who might have warned the next generation to be careful in the doorways. Everyone else, she wrote, is safe. Everyone else can walk past 100 of them a day and never know. Everyone else is not a threat, because everyone else will never speak. She had done all three. She had said it in her interviews, she had written it down in her translation, and she had warned the next generation in her final published letter. Then she moved to a village in the mountains and locked her door and stopped speaking to almost everyone she had ever known. Some believe she was frightened, some believe she had begun to see them everywhere. Some believe she had come to understand something she could not put into words and chose silence over the impossible task of explaining it. Whatever the reason, the tablet is still there. In its private collection, in its climate-controlled case, waiting for the next reader, waiting perhaps for someone who will look at the last line and understand it in a way Dr. Vogel did not want to understand it. If you have read this far, you have already seen one. That is what the scribe wrote. That is what he wanted us to know. That is what the giants, at the end of their generations, understood far too late to save themselves. The Nephilim were not afraid of death. They were not afraid of war. They were not afraid of the flood or the fire or the sword of any man that walked the ancient earth. They were afraid of the ones who stood in the doorway and watched. If the tablet is telling the truth, those ones are still in the doorway. Right now, in your city, in your building, possibly in the entrance to your own home, watching, recording, waiting for whatever it is that they have been waiting for. You have almost certainly walked past one this week. You did not notice, and you also did not remember, which is exactly and precisely according to the scribe of Nippur, how they always preferred it. Sleep well.